12,000 starving soldiers were trapped. In front of them, 40,000 of the world's most elite knights, hungry for blood. Behind them, a river. Annihilation was certain. But the starving men had a secret. A simple 6-foot piece of yew wood that was about to make the entire age of chivalry obsolete. This isn't just the story of a battle. It's the story of how the age of chivalry was brought to its knees by an army of peasants who refused to die. For weeks, the thrill of conquest had soured into a gnawing, constant fear. The army was exhausted, a ragged column whose bellies were empty and spirits were frayed. Their supply lines, stretched to the breaking point across a hostile land, had withered and died. Every meal was scavenged from a countryside they themselves had torched. The hunt was over. The hunters had become the hunted, cornered against the wide, unforgiving waters of the River Somme by a vengeful French king and the full might of his kingdom. Every bridge was broken, every ford guarded. There was no escape. Or was there? Their king, Edward III, was a man forged in the brutal politics of his own court and the endless, grinding wars against the Scots. He was 44 years old, a monarch in his prime, and a chillingly pragmatic commander. He had seized the throne from his own mother and her lover. A bloody affair that taught him ruthlessness was not a sin but a necessity of kingship. His claim to the French throne was the legal spark for this 100 Years' War, but Edward knew wars were won with fire and steel. This entire campaign was a high-stakes gamble, funded by Italian bankers who would see him ruined if he failed. Failure meant not just military defeat, but financial and political collapse back home. Where others saw a tomb on the banks of the Somme, he saw an opportunity. While his men foraged for scraps of food and prayed for a miracle, Edward spent 2 precious days searching, not for an escape route, but for the perfect killing ground. The situation was dire. The French army was closing in. For 2 days, the English were trapped, their scouts riding frantically along the riverbank, finding every path blocked. Panic began to set in. Then, a stroke of luck. An English sympathizer, a local man, was captured and under threat of execution or promise of gold, revealed the existence of a little-known tidal ford, the White Spot, named for the chalky bottom that made it passable, but only at low tide. It was a desperate race against time. The English army arrived to find the tide still high, and worse, a formidable French force of over 3,500 men waiting for them on the opposite bank. As the water began to recede, Edward gave the order to cross. What followed was a chaotic, desperate scramble. English knights, including the king's most trusted earls, plunged into the river, urging their horses forward into the chest-deep water. Genoese crossbowmen on the far bank unleashed a hail of bolts, and the water churned with blood and panicked men. The English longbowmen, lining their own bank, returned fire, providing crucial covering support. It was a battle fought in the middle of a river. For a moment, it seemed the English invasion would end right there, drowned in the Somme. But the sheer ferocity of the attack, driven by the terror of the trap closing behind them, was too much. They clawed their way onto the far bank and drove the French force back. The army scrambled across, just as the tide began to turn, a hair's breadth from disaster. They were across, but they were not safe. The French main army was now only hours behind. Edward needed his killing ground, and he needed it now, and their only hope for survival lay on a gentle, muddy slope. He found it. A gentle, grassy slope between the villages of Crécy and Wadicourt, flanked by a river on one side and dense woods on the other. To a French knight, it was unremarkable, just another piece of their country's green tapestry. To a master tactician like Edward, who had learned hard lessons fighting the Scots, it was a fortress made by nature. He had seen the folly of charging uphill against disciplined spearmen at Bannockburn, a humiliating English defeat. But he had also masterminded a stunning victory where he had dismounted his own knights and used his archers on the high ground to decimate a charge. This slope at Crécy was that tactic on a grander scale, a place to turn the enemy's greatest strength, their numbers and heavy cavalry, into their greatest weakness. Here, the cornered lion of England would turn and fight. Edward's orders were a revolution in themselves, a calculated insult to the very code of chivalry. Knights and lords, men whose entire identity was tied to the power of their war horses, were commanded to send their prized destriers to the rear and fight on foot. A knight's horse was a symbol of his status, a weapon of war, and his means of charging to glory or escaping danger. To fight on foot, alongside common men, was anathema to the aristocratic warrior. But Edward knew a line of men on foot, their feet planted firmly in the earth, was far harder to break than a chaotic cavalry charge. They would become a wall of steel. The army was arranged in 3 great divisions. 2 were positioned in the front, forming a shallow V shape designed to funnel the enemy into a concentrated killing zone, where they would be exposed to arrow fire from 2 sides. The 3rd, a powerful reserve, was held back, commanded by the king himself from a windmill atop the ridge, a makeshift command post with a perfect panoramic view. From this vantage point, he could see the entire field, gauge the flow of battle, and commit his reserves at the decisive moment. The men were given food and drink, told to rest on the grass, and to wait. The tension was palpable, a low hum of anxiety beneath the surface of professional calm, as they watched the horizon for the first glint of French steel. But they had no idea that the prey was a raging, disorganized tidal wave of steel that was about to crash down on them far sooner than anyone expected. At the heart of the line, in the place of greatest honor and greatest danger, stood the king's own son. Edward of Woodstock, known to history as the Black Prince, was only 16 years old, yet the weight of a kingdom already rested on his young shoulders. He was tall for his age, a warrior in the making, but no amount of training could fully prepare a boy for this. He watched the empty horizon, his hand clenching and unclenching on the cold steel of his sword hilt, a boy about to face his baptism by fire. But the real power of this army, its terrible world-changing secret, lay on its flanks. Here stood thousands of yeoman archers, common men from England and Wales. They were not frightened peasants, they were professionals, a product of a culture where archery was a national obsession, practiced by law every Sunday. Their weapon, the yew longbow, was a 6-foot stave of simple wood, but in their hands it was a killer. It required years of constant practice to develop the immense strength needed to draw its thick string to the ear, a draw weight of over 150 pounds, a process that often left archers with visibly deformed skeletons. They were human war machines. Along with hammering sharpened stakes into the earth to create a hidden fence against cavalry, they also dug thousands of small, knee-deep pits across their front, creating invisible, broken ground designed to trip charging war horses. Then, they planted their arrows in the soft ground before them, a forest of steel tips waiting. The logistics alone were staggering. Each archer carried a sheaf of 24 arrows, but wagons of reserves were positioned close behind. This battle would be won or lost on the relentless, industrial-scale delivery of steel-tipped wood. Across the valley, that storm assembled. Where the English were a silent, disciplined line, the French army was a glittering, chaotic sea of chivalry. Banners of silk and gold, bearing the crests of the greatest families in France, snapped in the wind. The French king's own hot-headed brother was there, along with dukes and counts, and allies from across Europe, including the blind king of Bohemia. This was not one army, but 100, a feudal host of powerful, arrogant nobles, each jostling for the glory of striking the first blow. Their leader, King Philip, was a product of his age. He understood the tactical risk. His scouts had reported the English position on the high ground, and his own men were tired. He gave the order to halt, to rest the men, and to attack in a disciplined fashion on the morrow. But his authority was a whisper against a hurricane of feudal pride. To understand that pride, you have to understand what the English had done to their country. For weeks, they had conducted the chevauchée, a campaign of systematic terror. The social contract of the Middle Ages was simple. The peasantry labored for the nobility, and the nobility provided protection. Edward's campaign shredded that contract. If a king could not protect his subjects, what right did he have to rule? Every burning village was a challenge to Philip's legitimacy. Villages that stood for centuries were turned to ash. The English moved with terrifying speed, not as conquerors, but as destroyers. Fields ripe for harvest were set ablaze, the smoke a constant, choking pillar of black that could be seen for miles. This was economic warfare at its most primitive. The wealthy city of Caen had been brutally sacked, its treasures stripped in a storm of violence that shocked the era. The wealth of Normandy was now slowing the English retreat. For the French nobility, this was an unbearable dishonor. Caution felt like cowardice. To them, the English were cornered, exhausted rats. The battle was already won. Ignoring the king's command, the knights at the front pressed forward, and the ripple of impatience became an unstoppable, disorganized wave. Leading this arrogant charge was a force of 6,000 Genoese crossbowmen, Europe's finest mercenaries. But today, they were exhausted from a grueling 17-mile march. A critical, almost unbelievable, error had been made. Their pavises, the enormous shields they used for cover while reloading, had been left behind. They were to advance up an open slope, completely exposed. Their commander protested, only to be met with contempt. "A man has to be a coward," a French noble sneered, "to ask to be spared from fighting." The crossbowmen were ordered forward, a reluctant, sacrificial vanguard. The French knights saw an easy victory. What they couldn't see was that the sky itself was about to declare war on them. If you enjoy learning about the pivotal moments that shaped our world, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into history's greatest battles. As if on cue, the sky darkened. A sudden, violent thunderstorm erupted, drenching the field. Cold rain turned the gentle slope into a slick, muddy morass. For the Genoese, it was a disaster. The gut and sinew strings of their crossbows were soaked, rendered slack and feeble. On the ridge, the English archers performed a simple act of fieldcraft. Each man unstrung his yew bow and tucked the coiled hemp string under his leather cap, keeping it perfectly dry. As the storm passed, the late afternoon sun emerged, now shining directly into the eyes of the advancing French. The miserable, soaked Genoese formed their lines and, with a great shout intended to intimidate the English, fired their first volley. It was pathetic. The heavy bolts, lacking power, arced weakly and fell harmlessly into the mud. Then came the English reply. A single command rang out: "Loose!" It was a sound like a million monstrous bees taking flight, a terrifying hum that shook the air. A cloud of 10,000 arrows rose from the English line, blotting out the sun before descending with sickening force on the unshielded mercenaries. Chroniclers would later say the arrows fell so thick it looked like snow. A trained longbowman could fire 10, even 12 arrows a minute. The crossbowman was lucky to fire 2. It was a mismatch of industrial proportions. The sound was not of individual impacts, but a single, wet, tearing noise, followed by an eruption of screams. Men fell, riddled with shafts, as the disciplined Genoese line dissolved into a panicked mob. They dropped their useless crossbows and fled. The French knights, watching from behind, were filled with disgust. Seeing the flight as base cowardice, they roared in outrage. "Treason!" they cried. "Kill these cowards!" The leading French nobles lowered their lances and charged not at the English, but straight into the backs of their own retreating allies, hacking down the fleeing Genoese. The French vanguard was broken, trampled by their own knights. The slope was now a chaotic mess. But this was only the beginning. Now, the true test would come. 15 waves of the most powerful heavy cavalry in the world. And standing in their way was a boy. The ground trembled as the flower of French chivalry began its charge into a death trap. The perfect, ordered charge dissolved as horses slipped in the mud, funneling into the V formation. The English arrow storm began again. At this closer range, armor-piercing bodkin points punched through visors and joints of plate armor. The main targets, however, were the horses. Unarmored and massive, they were shredded by volley after volley. The screams of wounded animals were a terrible chorus. They crashed into riders behind them, creating a horrific pile-up of screaming animals and crushed men. The first charge never reached the English line. It broke upon a barricade of its own dead. And still, the French came. Blinded by a chivalric code that demanded valor over tactics, they mounted charge after charge. 15 times, the nobility of France hurled itself up that bloody slope. 15 times, each wave was broken, adding to the growing rampart of corpses. When a few knights did struggle through, they were met by the wall of dismounted men-at-arms, who hacked the exhausted French from their saddles. Which historical figure's story do you find the most captivating? Let us know in the comments below. The epicenter of this storm was the division commanded by the 16-year-old Black Prince. Wave after wave of the most determined French knights crashed against his position. The line bent, it groaned, but it did not break. At the height of the fighting, a frantic messenger was sent to the king, fearing the prince's position was about to be overwhelmed. The knight found Edward in his windmill, observing the battle with an unnerving calm. He begged the king to send the reserve. Edward, from his unique vantage point, could see the French charges were disorganized and that his son's line was holding. This was a calculated test. He looked down at the chaotic scene and asked a simple question. Is my son dead, or unhorsed, or so wounded that he cannot help himself? The knight assured him the prince was unharmed. Then go back to those who sent you, the king replied, and tell them not to send for me again, so long as my son is alive. For I wish the day to be his, and the honor to rest with him. Let the boy win his spurs. It was a moment of supreme, calculated confidence or breathtaking cruelty. Edward was not just winning a battle, he was forging a king. Amid the carnage, one of the most poignant and surreal acts of the age of chivalry unfolded. The blind King John of Bohemia, hearing the sounds of battle, realized his cause was lost but refused to flee. He turned to his retainers and gave a final command. Sirs, he said, you are my men, my companions. I require you. Lead me so far forward that I may strike one stroke with my sword. His knights, weeping, agreed. They tied their horses' bridles to his, and as one, they charged headlong into the English lines, into the heart of the arrow storm, and into legend, the final, defiant roar of a dying age. As twilight fell, the fighting ended, not with a climactic clash, but with the utter exhaustion and dissolution of the French army. King Philip himself, having fought bravely and been wounded in the face by an arrow, was finally led from a field of unimaginable horror. The English, wary of a trick, remained in their positions, their knuckles white. They had held. At dawn, King Edward descended from the windmill. He walked onto a field of almost unimaginable horror. The gentle slope was gone, buried beneath a carpet of bodies. The French dead were not scattered. They were piled in great heaps, tangled mounds of men and horses, their fine armor splattered with mud and blood. The scale of the carnage was breathtaking. In contrast, the English losses were shockingly light, perhaps a few hundred men at most. It was not a victory, it was a slaughter. The emotional climax of the morning was not one of triumph, but of quiet relief. Edward walked through the carnage until he found the Black Prince. His son was alive, leaning on his sword, his face black with grime, surrounded by the weary, blood-splattered men who had held the line with him. The king embraced his son. No words were needed. The boy who had stood at the head of the vanguard was now a proven commander. He had survived his baptism by fire. He had won his spurs. As the sun rose higher, the grim work began. English priests moved across the field, offering last rites. Scribes and heralds followed, tasked with counting the cost. The heralds, experts in coats of arms, walked through the heaps of the slain, identifying the great lords, not by their mangled faces, but by the rich emblems on their surcoats. The tally was stunning. Over 1,500 French lords, knights, and barons lay dead. The blind king of Bohemia was found among them, his knights still tied to him in their final loyal embrace. The French had lost a generation of their nobility in a single afternoon. The disaster wasn't even over. The next day, English patrols fell upon scattered groups of French reinforcements who were blundering onto the field, unaware the battle was over, and slaughtered them as well. It was a disaster on a scale that would cripple the kingdom for decades. If this story of incredible courage against all odds moved you, please share it with others who appreciate history. The legacy of that day would echo for centuries. Crécy was more than a battle. It was a revolution. On that bloody slope, the supremacy of the mounted armored knight, which had dominated European battlefields for 300 years, was violently and decisively ended. It was a victory of tactics over brute force, of discipline over feudal arrogance. The victory immediately allowed Edward to march north and lay siege to the vital port of Calais, which would fall after a year and remain an English foothold in France for 2 centuries. But the history books often focus on the kings and princes. The great lords of France lay dead. A prince had won his spurs. But the true victor of Crécy was the man who now rested his 6-foot yew bow against his shoulder, his face a mask of exhaustion and grim satisfaction. He was not a knight, he was a killer. And on this day, he and thousands like him had proven that the heart of an army was not its chivalry, but its people. The age of the professional foot soldier was born in the hissing storm of 10,000 English arrows. The Battle of Crécy is a testament to how strategy, technology, and the unyielding will of an army, fighting for its very survival, can overturn the odds and change the course of history. To witness more stories of the incredible battles that defined our world, make sure you are subscribed to the channel and have notifications turned on. Let us know in the comments what piece of history you believe deserves to be told next.